GMOs. I mean, I know a lot of Americans are protesting it in this country. What's the situation in Europe, and can that situation filter over and help us here?
I certainly hope it can, because what you have in Europe, I published a book on this in 2006 called Seeds of Destruction, the Hidden Agenda of GMO, and it shocked a lot of people at the time. Now they're coming back to me and saying, William, I thought you were extreme in your analysis of what's behind this. Now I realize, if anything, you were too conservative. GMO is about a project that was started at the end of the Second World War by the same interests who controlled big oil, namely, they have a name. It's called the Rockefeller family, Rockefeller Foundation, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Nelson Rockefeller at the time went down to Mexico and to South America. He had been ahead of the essentially the CIA predecessor for Latin America during the war under FDR. And Nelson Rockefeller had the idea, from his extensive connections across South and Central America, that if he could do to agriculture what Standard Oil had done to oil, i.e. create a monopoly, the vertical integration of the whole oil chain, the energy chain, refining, transportation, drilling and exploration, and so forth, then they would amass enormous power. They created a project at Harvard Business School, financed by Rockefeller money, which they dubbed agribusiness. The two Harvard professors who came up with the model called it agribusiness. We turn the cultivation of land for food, for human and animal consumption, we turn that into a pure for-profit business, like a corporation. Well, this notion is so common today because most of American farming, family farming, has been converted into for-hire labor for agribusiness, giant multinational corporations. And this has created a top-down monopolization or concentration. I think one of the words for it is monopsony. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in any case, the idea of this concentration is very clear to people. 10 or 20 companies control the global beef market, the market for chicken, processed chicken, corn, soybeans. You have Archer Daniel Midland,
Huge,
you have
yeah.
Bunge, you have Cargill, and so forth. And this agribusiness lobby of 20 to 30 giant corporations, back in the 70s and the 80s, the same Rockefeller Foundation got the idea, if we can somehow patent the seeds that are essential to food and get control over them, then we are very close to our goal of control of food. Well, this goes back to another quote by Henry Kissinger, also back in the 70s. You control oil, you control nations. Control food, you control the people.
That's true.
This is about control. The food that we eat is about certain powerful corporate interests, these 150 global corporations that are centered in the U.S. and to a certain extent in Europe, but tied into the U.S. corporate nexus. They are after control. They're not after quality or health or whatever. They're after control, and at the top, they're after a population reduction. They said so openly. The family of Bill Gates is a leading member of the eugenics lobby. Eugenics means reducing undesirable eaters from the population gene pool with forced sterilization, which was done in the U.S. back in the 20s and the 30s and 40s, or whatever means possible. So dramatically reducing. People like Ted Turner of CNN have gone on record saying a world population of 220 million would be about ideal, from my mind.
Well, one of the president's advisors, John Holdren, wasn't he? Didn't he write a position paper years ago talking about planetary population control? Sure.
Yeah, mandatory population control, forced sterilization, the kind of thing that the Rockefeller Foundation actually convinced the Chinese government to go for, and now they're beginning to suffer the consequences of the one-child policy. But in any case, these powerful families that are so influential behind the scenes, they're not necessarily the ones we see in public, but they have this power and this money. They're terrified that the masses are going to rise up and figure out the game and begin reacting on this. So drastically reduce population. Wars are one way to do it. Diseases and not allowing clean water in Africa. Instead, giving them vaccines like Bill Gates Foundation wants to do. Vaccinate every African child and make sure they're permanently, chronically ill and operating at half their strength until they die of diseases that they never had before. But getting back to the GMO question, when I started researching this for the book, for the Seeds of Destruction book, back some years ago, and I discovered that the Rockefeller Foundation was the key financing side of this every step of the way from the initiation, and that the same Rockefeller Foundation was the key. Now, this is pretty shocking. It was very shocking for me. Back in the 1920s, going right up into the Third Reich of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in Germany, all of German eugenics research, this forced sterilization study of all sorts of population disorders, that was all financed by the Rockefeller Foundation.
Right. Do you think people like Gates are well-intentioned and they just don't understand what's really going on?
I think Bill Gates understands very, very well what he's doing with his money from his Microsoft fortune. I think he understands very well. His father was the head of something called Planned Parenthood, which is one of the stable of Rockefeller population control eugenics.
Hold on, William. We're going to take this quick break, come back, take some calls, and we'll see how your back's holding up. We'll be back. And welcome back to Coast with Wm Engdahl, of course. We'll take your calls as well. William, one of my concerns about GMOs, playing around with Mother Nature. At what point do we realize that we've made a horrendous mistake and there's no turning back?
Well, this is the scary thing, if you want, about GMOs, is that when the first experiments were being made with the so-called gene cannon of taking a foreign bacteria, a fungus or whatever, will you, and literally shooting it into the DNA of a particular plant, such as soy or corn, you're releasing something that's inherently unstable. I've talked to some of the leading genetic experts on this in the world, and I was pleased to hear you're having someone I'm very, very much a fan of in his work on the cells and so forth, Bruce Lipton.
Yes.
The biology of belief. I'm a great fan of his work. But the point is to reduce the GMO is based on something called scientific reductionism, to put it in its simplest form. And the reductionist notion, it's fraudulent science, but the idea is the dream of these eugenics families of Rockefeller et al., Gates, is that you can reduce life, the essence of human life, down to a single gene, a genetic structure, and then begin to manipulate, like mad scientists, begin to manipulate the characteristic traits of this particular gene to produce a race of geniuses, to produce something where people will die out at a certain age after they've had a productive work life, and you don't have to pay their Social Security or their health bills. They just magically die off. This is the kind of thing that they play around with in their private discussions at these elite resort areas that they attend. But the point about GMO is that it's inherently unstable. There have been no scientific independent studies up until last year of the effects of GMO on rats over a 2-year lifespan of rats. The only studies that are done for the U.S. FDA approval, for any U.S. government approval, are the studies that Monsanto and the GMO companies themselves submit, and there have been
that's right, or commission. Right?
Is that the Monsanto forces the labs to fake their results, so they exclude uncomfortable data. So we are feeding our population poison. There was a study by a group of scientists at Kean University in France, and it was published in September of last year in the respected journal called Food and Chemical Toxicology. Gilles-Eric Seralini, Professor Seralini, led this group, and they were the first ever to study rats, a group of 200 rats, over the 2-year lifespan of the rats. Monsanto's studies never go beyond 90 days. And what was interesting about this study, and it was peer-reviewed, there's no question that it was a serious study, What was interesting about this is that they first, what they found is an alarming incidence, more than just statistically marginal, an alarming incidence of tumors, cancer tumors, in rats fed with a diet of Monsanto GMO corn.
And early death in these rats,
and
right?
early death, organ damages, and so forth. But the tumors appeared only 4 to 7 months into the study. So the 90-day studies, 3-month studies, you didn't see these signs, and that's the key point. So the fact that it takes 20 years after the first commercial introduction of Monsanto, GMO products onto the first the U.S. market, then Latin America, and now indirectly worldwide through the soybeans and GMO corn that's fed to European cattle and pigs and so forth. It's spread widely throughout the world now, but and there's never been an independent government study. There's a reason for this. I talk about it in the Seeds of Destruction book. George Herbert Walker Bush, Daddy Bush, was president in 1992. He had a closed-door meeting with the top people at Monsanto from St. Louis, who had the jump on everyone with this GMO patenting of seeds. And Monsanto got President Bush to agree to a doctrine called the Doctrine of Substantial Equivalence, meaning a GMO ear of corn looks like a non-GMO normal ear of corn. Its kernels are yellow like normal corn. It has a green sheath covering it and whatnot. So we'll say that it's substantially equivalent to normal corn. And because of that, we'll say there's no separate testing that needs to be done. Well, this is madness. You're doing the most radical experiment, genetic manipulation of the basic food stuff that the population eats, and you're saying as a responsible government, you don't need to do any special tests on this. Well, that is pure politics and corruption, and the man who's responsible for drafting the guidelines of this for the FDA is a man named Michael Taylor, back then in 1992. Well, Michael Taylor went on to leave government and become a vice president of Monsanto, and now he's back at the FDA running policy for the Obama administration. So this is independent of Democrat or Republican. This is really institutional policy of this elite grouping that I mentioned at the beginning of the 150 giant corporations that are literally out to control the world. I don't see any other way to describe it.
All right, let's take some calls with you, William. Joe in Rochester, New York. Hey, Joe, thanks for calling.
Yes, George, thank you for taking my call. William, sir, thank you also. My question is pertaining to the family farm that you had talked about in the United States. I've heard a lot of scuttlebutt and haven't really researched it. But is it true that Ronald Reagan had a lot to do with the destroying of the family farm in the United States?
Well, it began big time during the Reagan administration. He wasn't the only president. Every president since then. Basically, the U.S. Department of Agriculture is where you have to look at that, and that sets policy for the family farm and the various agriculture bills that were passed by Congress. And the drafting of those bills was dominated by a food lobby with people such as Cargill, the vice president of Cargill, Archer Daniels Midland, and so forth, ConAgra, the Tyson Foods for chicken, and so forth. And these giant, semi-monopoly agribusiness holdings began step by step over the past, and it really took a heavy beginning during the Reagan era back in the 80s, such that the laws and the policies of the U.S. Department of Agriculture favored the big business agribusiness and not the family farm. So more and more, simply to survive, the family farmer, and I know many good, honest farmers, they're the salt of the earth. If we lose them, we've lost the ability to feed the human species, ladies and gentlemen.
We're also losing farmland to large corporations, aren't we?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And then the industrialized usage of these lands is destroying the topsoil. You're not, you're losing the soil nutrients. The massive use of fertilizers. By the way, with GMO, there's a myth that the companies promote that with GMO soybean or corn or whatever from Monsanto or whoever makes it, you need less chemicals, you need less weed killers, because of the GMO trait, is matched to the weed killer that Monsanto makes, called Roundup, the most widely used weed killer in the world. And what happens is there are super resistant weeds that develop. Nature has its way of getting around man-made creations. So these super weeds are literally choking off hundreds and thousands of acres of cropland, and you can't get rid of some of these weeds. It's a massive problem after 10 years or so of cultivating GMO crops like soybean. So these aren't being talked about in the mainstream media, but it's an enormous problem, and it's directly related to the use of these glyphosate paired chemicals. The herbicides are paired to the GMO seed. So you have Roundup-ready soybeans ready to receive Roundup, and Roundup kills everything in sight initially, except for the GMO soybeans of Monsanto. And that's the game. So they're paired with these chemicals. That's the trait that they're made. But the chemicals become ineffective, so you have to use other herbicide chemicals to kill the weeds. And so you end up using more chemicals on the plants than you would without. And the chemicals, this is a whole other story, George. Your listeners should be aware of this, because many people use Roundup in their gardens and think nothing of it. The ingredients in Roundup, they're a trade secret of Monsanto, but the adjuvants, or the additional ingredients in addition to glyphosate, the tests in Kean University have examined the effects of that on the embryo, the cells of the embryo in a pregnant mother, in quantities far less than what you spray in your garden to kill weeds. And they found that it kills seeds in a human embryo. So this is coming through the groundwater. It's coming into the drinking water. It's prevalent because of the widespread spraying of soybean fields and aerial spraying and so forth with this Roundup, with glyphosate and other toxic chemicals. So you just it is horrendous, and that's the whole GMO agenda. It's not creating bigger harvest yields for the farmer. It's not creating better economics. It's making him a seed slave to Monsanto or DuPont, Dow Chemical, or Syngenta, these 4 or 5 companies.